one other person preach about the men of Issachar, or talk about the men of Issachar, and his name is Dr. Rick Paul. He's a thoracic surgeon in the Netherlands that works with ICMDA, and it was a similar message. But thank you for those words of admonishment as well as encouragement.
You're welcome. There's a period when, invariably, when I'm working on a message like this, that starts out with what seems like a good idea and intent, where you ask, will this actually deliver on the intent? So I appreciate the feedback.
And, I would go, now you said at the end that God had placed us at this particular moment in time. And also, all the biblical characters were all divinely appointed times. And so you asked whether God brought the coronavirus. He certainly, he created all things.
Mm-hmm.
So you can argue whether it's a punishment or not, but I think he's in control of that too.
Well, I do too. I think the longer I live and the longer I think about these things, the more clearly I see that when the Bible talks about the whole creation groaning because of the fall of man, that all of the systems are corrupted. Everything as a system is corrupted, and it's like your computer. You can have a virus in your computer, and it will work. It'll be slow, it'll be irascible, it'll be clunky, it'll shut down on you, but it'll work. And the longer I look, the longer that I spend time on this, the more I think it's a consequence of the fall. God can obviously turn somebody white from leprosy instantaneously. So that is certainly within his capability. But I kind of avoid the debate by saying God created the coronavirus to punish us. It might close off some discussion, otherwise useful discussion on the subject.
Well, speaking of discussion, we also wanted to offer a time for questions for those who have some questions about either Zeke's devotional or just some things about his ministry that he does now, or anything that struck you from tonight's conversation.
Zeke, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
My name is Dennis Sullivan. I'm a retired physician, and I'm the Ohio director for CMDA and the High Representative, I should say. And I'm just curious if you, from your work with HIV-AIDS in Africa, can you give us sort of a bird's eye view of where we stand with that pandemic right now? We're so distracted by COVID, but I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about where things stand in terms of the AIDS crisis in Africa.
Okay, so I can speak with authority for one country, as much authority as someone who's been going there for 16 years and for a couple of weeks a year and involved. I also have some experience in Nigeria, but not in the area where it's a great problem. When I started going there 16 years ago, it was a crisis in the US and it was a crisis there, and people were panicked, and there was lots of activity and lots of AIDS activists floating around. I learned the definition between fat AIDS and slim AIDS. Does anybody know what that is? Slim AIDS are those that have the disease. Fat AIDS are the people that are making a living off of the disease. But so a positive medical thing is that between when I started there and now, the South African government has figured out how to make much better use of antiretrovirals. So there are health advantages. That's good news. The bad news is people have just factored it in as a fact of life. It's pastors are burying people every week with complications of AIDS, whether it's admitted or not, and aren't addressing the behavior changes that it takes in order to stop AIDS. I mean, one of the remarkable things to me about this whole thing, I can't control whether I get cancer. Frankly, if I'm in a malarial area, I can hardly control whether I get malaria. But it's so clear that there are kind of two things you can stop doing or avoid doing, sex and drugs, and you can escape this thing. And, this is where, this is not exactly answering your question, but if you think that people can't or won't postpone sex or reserve sex for marriage, you do exactly what the AIDS cabal is recommending. You pass out condoms and hope for a cure. And if you actually believe that the guy that wrote the owner's manual said that there is a proper place for sex, you can put it in its proper place, you can keep it in its proper place, you do what some other folks are doing, which is trying to help people understand, yes, you can live in a biblical fashion. But Dennis, does that come close enough to answer? I mean, they're still burying people. Some of you may have seen a shot from a cemetery whose name begins with O, and I can't pronounce it, in Soweto. But it was, and I've seen it in a couple of different places, but it just shows grave after grave after grave after grave, COVID graves. And that's not much different than what AIDS was when we started going, and to some degree, not much different than the AIDS situation is now.
Yeah, Zeke, I think your comments about attitude are very similar to what I found. A while ago, I worked as a missionary in Central African Republic, and we had a similar kind of attitude, kind of a fatalism in the society about HIV/AIDS. And it was very hard in a culture that is patriarchal, where men are so dominant and men and women have very few rights. Men call the shots, and they don't want to be told that they can't have multiple partners and multiple wives. And so, yes, I think your comments about this cultural fatalism is very appropriate, and that hasn't changed much from back in the days when I was in the subcontinent.
Right. And I think there's a cultural context for that, because there are other disease conditions that in more developed nations have been resolved and haven't been resolved there. So at the end of the day, AIDS is just one more thing on a pile of things that are already problematic.
Thank you.
Connected with that conversation, Zeke, I've heard that in some areas AIDS spreads because of misunderstanding of how it spreads, or like a lack of education. Is that true, or is that still part of the issue in addition to the fatalism?
So, my area of expertise is working in Soweto, which is an acronym for Southwest Townships around Johannesburg. It's about as cosmopolitan as you'll get. There is a street close to where we work that's the only street in the world that has been the home of 2 Nobel laureates, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. So, and it was interesting. I was at a camp once, and I was looking out at the kids, and I realized that as long as AIDS had been an issue, these kids had been alive. So their parents knew a pre-AIDS situation, but the kids didn't. So in those environments, I can't speak for all of Africa. It's not a matter of not knowing what the transmission route is. It's just a matter of being unwilling to change behavior as a result.
Great, thanks.
Well, Lydia, if I could comment, I think there are certain myths that are probably still perpetuated in Africa, in addition to the male-dominant society. And I think what we're finding, whether it's in Africa or in the US, there's just a big issue of trust. People don't know who to trust anymore. So I've read in Uganda that they were claiming that they had reduced the amount of HIV. And basically what they did was they rounded up all the people that were HIV positive and isolated them and put them in a village, whatever, and didn't let them see the light of day or the rest of the world or converse with the rest of the world. So I think that's, it's a mixture of everything that's already been said, plus there are still people that live by the myths.
Right. Yeah, Uganda had a very successful program, and it started out because General Museveni saw his army being devastated by AIDS. And so when he took over power, he and his wife began a really active campaign. It was kind of a bullhorn campaign, everywhere he went. And the campaign was no grazing. I mean, it was AIDS kills, but no grazing. And no grazing isn't quite as pure as you might think of a biblical idea of marriage, but it's don't have sex with people you don't know. And they did a remarkable job of driving down the AIDS rate. And then the global powers who have the answers started introducing the condom approach, and things started to spike. Condoms are effective in the 90% range in preventing pregnancy if used correctly and every time. And so the real issues are not with the condoms for the most part, it's used every time. I mean, frightening stories as I've worked on this, interviewing a guy on tape, and he basically said she's too pretty to have AIDS. I mean, just how do you deal with a situation like that?
Do we have any other questions for Zeke?
Well, Jim, thank you for the invitation. It gave me an opportunity to put together some thoughts that have been running around in the back of my mind on this subject. Those of you who have the slides have my phone number and email address. If there's any other questions that you have or any way I can help, please let me know.